$65,000. That is a number the state of Georgia just carved into Rick Ross' front door. And Rick Ross, the self-proclaimed boss, the mogul, the man who calls his mansion the promised land, apparently did not notice it stacking up for 4 straight years. For years. That is not a mistake. That is not an accountant on vacation. That is a man who looked at a tax bill and decided he was too big to pay it, until the state of Georgia decided Rick Ross was not too big to embarrass. And the second that paperwork hit the internet, 50 Cent, who has been sitting on the sidelines of Rick Ross' life like a hawk for 15 years, finally got the moment 50 Cent has been praying for since the George Bush administration. Watch until the very end, because there is a detail buried inside this tax execution that nobody is talking about, a detail that reframes every single brag Rick Ross ever made about the promised land. And once you see it, you will never look at that 109-room mansion the same way again. Let me set the scene, because you have to understand the size of the fall before you understand the size of the laugh. Rick Ross owns an estate in Fayetteville, Georgia, that Rick Ross bought from Evander Holyfield for $5.8 million. 200-plus acres. 109 rooms. 54,000 square feet of marble, chandeliers, gold trim, and cinematic backdrops that Rick Ross has been feeding to Instagram like an all-you-can-eat brag buffet. Scenes from Coming to America 2 were shot on those grounds. The Rick Ross car show pulls millions onto that lawn every single year. Rick Ross does not just live there. Rick Ross performs there. That property is not a home. That property is the entire thesis statement of the Rick Ross brand. And now the Georgia Department of Revenue has stapled a delinquency notice to the thesis. Here is where the math gets ugly. The original bill was $29,043. That number sat on Rick Ross' ledger since 2021. Quiet, patient, growing like mold behind the drywall. And Georgia did not blink. Georgia did not send a strongly worded letter. Georgia let the interest breathe. Georgia let the penalties multiply. Georgia let the collection fees pile on top of collection fees. And then, when the bill had ballooned to $64,995.21, Georgia filed a tax execution against the very land Rick Ross calls promised. Interest, $10,576. Penalties, $19,516. Collection fees, $5,800 and change. Numbers so specific they read like a receipt. And every one of those digits is a post-it note stuck to the forehead of a man who told the world Rick Ross had figured money out. Because that is the twist. Rick Ross did not just make music. Rick Ross made a religion. And the sermon was always the same. Assets over liabilities. Own the building. Cut your own grass. Fly commercial. Rick Ross literally headlined a revolt series called Assets Over Liabilities, sitting in a leather chair, staring into the camera, explaining well to the audience like a professor who had graduated from every business school Rick Ross had never actually attended. Rick Ross went on Patrick Bet David and dismissed 50 Cent net worth in a single breath. Rick Ross claimed 50 Cent lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. Rick Ross said 50 Cent could wash the bottom of Rick Ross' yacht. Rick Ross offered to buy 50 Cent masters on camera, on Instagram, in interviews, over and over again, until the offer stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like a hobby. And 50 Cent, being 50 Cent, wrote every single word of it down in a mental filing cabinet labeled Rick Ross. And 50 Cent waited. The wait ended the moment the Georgia paperwork went public. 50 Cent hit Instagram the way Rick Ross hits a plate of ribs at a Wingstop grand opening. Immediate, loud, without a napkin. But 50 Cent did not have to invent anything. 50 Cent did not have to Photoshop a receipt. 50 Cent did not have to hire a graphic designer. The state of Georgia had already done the work. The promised land delinquent. The mogul behind. The boss buried in penalties that started smaller than a used car. That is not a diss track. That is a court filing with a caption slot at the bottom. Now, here's the part that separates real fans of this feud from tourists. Nobody who has watched Rick Ross and 50 Cent trade blows since 2008 was surprised. This feud has been a slow-motion demolition derby for 15 years, and Rick Ross has been a guy driving the Rolls-Royce into the wall while insisting the wall was actually the finish line. It started at the BET Awards. 50 Cent gave Rick Ross a look. Rick Ross rapped about the look. 50 Cent responded by exhuming Rick Ross' entire pre-fame biography. And what 50 Cent pulled out of the ground was the single most damaging document in hip-hop feud history. A photograph. Rick Ross in a correctional officer uniform, badge shining, radio clipped, sworn in as an officer of the law in the state of Florida, while Rick Ross' musical persona was busy narrating cocaine deals. 50 Cent stamped Rick Ross with the name Officer Ricky and never let go. That was 2008. It is 2026. And Officer Ricky still lives rent-free in every Google search that ever tried to define Rick Ross. But here is the layer nobody in the current news cycle is telling you. The tax execution is not the first act. It is the fourth. Rick Ross has been rehearsing this exact scene since 2012, and the receipts are public. 12 years ago, the IRS filed the first lien on Rick Ross property. That was a warning shot. Rick Ross ignored it. By 2018, Rick Ross had to write a $4.6 million check to the IRS just to keep the mansion standing. $4.6 million, not $4.6 thousand. Millions. Then another $1.1 million bill surfaced for tax years 2013 and 2014, showing up years after Rick Ross thought the closet was clean. Then a $100,000 fine from the U.S. Department of Labor for how Rick Ross Boss Wings Company allegedly treated employees at 5 Mississippi Wingstop locations, illegally charging workers for uniforms and background checks. That is not a boss move. That is a boss making workers pay for the privilege of working for the boss. Then came the 2024 car show lawsuit, where a paraplegic attendee named Darius Strader paid $500 for VIP access to the Rick Ross car and bike show. And then, according to the lawsuit, Rick Ross event allegedly forgot that wheelchairs exist. Hours in the Florida heat. Promised accessible shuttles that never came. Rick Ross denied liability. Rick Ross pushed to dismiss. But by the time the tax execution dropped in Georgia, the pattern was no longer a rumor. The pattern was a spreadsheet. And 50 Cent had every row highlighted, cross-referenced, and screenshotted, because 50 Cent has been running the Rick Ross beat like an unpaid intern who never took a lunch break. And this is where the story finally reveals what nobody else has connected. Because if you actually zoom in on the timeline, something surgical shows up. The original tax bill hit Rick Ross' ledger in 2021. What else happened in 2021? Rick Ross posted a video of himself gifting his 16-year-old son a Wingstop franchise for a birthday present. A whole Wingstop, on camera, bragging. The same year Rick Ross forgot to pay a $29,000 bill to the state that houses the promised land. Rick Ross was handing out fast food kingdoms to teenagers while ghosting the Department of Revenue, like the Department of Revenue was a bad Tinder date. That is not a coincidence. That is a mindset. And that mindset is exactly what 50 Cent has been trying to expose for 15 years. The show is louder than the books. The performance is louder than the accounting. And eventually, the accounting always sends a letter. Now, let me hit you with a number that actually matters, because everybody is stuck on 65,000, and 65,000 is not the real story. The real story is the gap. Rick Ross has publicly claimed net worth figures anywhere from $45 million on the low estimate to $180 million on the high side. Rick Ross has said Rick Ross spent $70 million on a house and a jet in a single 6-month stretch. $70 million, and yet $65,000 in property taxes, a rounding error at that altitude. A tip on a bar tab for a man of that self-declared caliber was allowed to sit for 4 straight years until Georgia had to publicly execute against the state. That is not a cash flow problem. That is a priority problem. That is what happens when the persona has to be fed before the paperwork. That is what happens when a mogul is really a mascot. And 50 Cent knows the difference. 50 Cent has been the mogul. 50 Cent took the vitamin water sale to the bank, produced Power, built G-Unit Film and Television, and yes, filed bankruptcy in 2015. But 50 Cent emerged with television, distribution, streaming deals, and a net worth that quietly climbed while Rick Ross was still tweeting Rolls-Royce keys. But here is where the story gets sharper. Rick Ross is not sitting still. Rick Ross just put a Southwest Ranches, Florida mansion on the market for $6.5 million. Rick Ross bought that property from former NBA player Amari Stoudemire for $3.5 million, which means Rick Ross doubled the money on paper, which is a legitimately smart real estate play. Rick Ross Camp is framing the sale as strategic, consolidating around the Georgia compound, freeing capital for a new venture, a cryptocurrency platform called BitFortune, launched with a partner named Gamma. Rick Ross has an album called Set in Stone Dropping. Rick Ross is not retreating. Rick Ross is repositioning. And Rick Ross wants the world to see this moment as evolution, not erosion. But there's a very specific problem with that framing, and 50 Cent spotted it before the ink was dry. If Rick Ross is truly restructuring, why did the tax bill sit for 4 years? Restructuring is a decision made from strength. Ignoring a bill for 4 years while it triples in size is a decision made from something else entirely. Restructuring does not require the Georgia Department of Revenue to publicly file execution paperwork against the flagship property. Restructuring is quiet. Restructuring is a lawyer, a phone call, and a wire transfer. What happened in Georgia is not restructuring. What happened in Georgia is the state got tired of waiting. And when a state gets tired of waiting, the state does not send another notice. The state sends a headline. And here is the punchline that no other channel is going to give you. The promised land, that name, that brand, that entire mythology Rick Ross built around the Fayetteville estate, was borrowed, not stolen, borrowed, from a biblical concept about a land promised to a people who wandered 40 years to reach it. 40 years of wilderness, 40 years of testing, 40 years of proving worthiness. And now, the Rick Ross promised land is on the wrong end of a tax execution file for a debt Rick Ross let wander for 4 years unpaid. For years, not 40, 4. And Georgia decided that was long enough. The symbolism writes itself, and Rick Ross has no comeback for symbolism, because symbolism does not care about your rap sheet, your car show, or how many Wingstop locations your son technically owns on paper. 50 Cent is not done. 50 Cent is never done. 50 Cent treats the Rick Ross feud like a subscription service. And every time Rick Ross Live produces new content, 50 Cent renews a plan. The reason this particular hit landed harder than any other in 15 years is not the number. 65,000 is small. The reason it landed is because it hit the promised land specifically. It hit the property Rick Ross used as a stage. It hit the mansion Rick Ross used as a backdrop for the Assets Over Liabilities lecture. It hit the estate Rick Ross paraded through every music video, every podcast, every Instagram post about how Rick Ross had figured out money in a way that lesser rappers had not. It hit the exact spot where the persona lives. And 50 Cent understands something that Rick Ross has never quite grasped. In hip-hop, you do not lose because you run out of money. You lose because you run out of consistency. Rick Ross has spent 15 years telling the world Rick Ross was the boss. Rick Ross has spent 15 years mocking 50 Cent finances. Rick Ross has spent 15 years offering to buy 50 Cent masters from the deck of a rented yacht. And now, in a single afternoon, the state of Georgia handed 50 Cent a document that says the boss forgot to pay the boss taxes on the boss house for 4 boss years. That is not a diss. That is a receipt. And a receipt beats a diss track every single day of the week, because you cannot argue with a receipt. You can only be embarrassed by one. Here is what happens next, because this is not the ending. This is the middle. Rick Ross will pay the $65,000. Rick Ross will pay it fast. Rick Ross may have already paid it by the time you finish watching. Rick Ross will post a video from the Promised Land pool laughing it off. Rick Ross will say the government is picking on Rick Ross. Rick Ross will call it a distraction from a new album. Rick Ross will do everything a mogul is trained to do when the mogul narrative gets a scratch. And 50 Cent will screenshot every second of it, add a caption in that unmistakable 50 Cent all caps energy, and post it to 50 million followers before Rick Ross has finished a caption on Rick Ross' own post. Because that is the loop. That is the machinery. That is what has kept both of these men culturally relevant, while newer rappers rise and fall in a single album cycle. But there is something Rick Ross should be paying more attention to than 50 Cent, and Rick Ross is not. The next tax year is already running. The next lawsuit is already forming. The next lien is being drafted in an office building somewhere. The Boss Wings labor situation is still ongoing. The car show accessibility lawsuit is still in litigation. The Southwest Ranches mansion has not sold yet. The Bitfortune crypto venture has not been tested by a full market cycle. And every one of those pending problems is a future 50 Cent Instagram post waiting to be born. Rick Ross does not have a 50 Cent problem. Rick Ross has a paperwork problem. And paperwork does not lose feuds. Paperwork lets other people win them. Rewind for a second, because you cannot understand why $65,000 hit the internet like a nuclear payload unless you understand what the Promised Land is supposed to mean. Rick Ross did not stumble onto that estate. Rick Ross hunted the estate. Rick Ross specifically wanted the House of Vander Holyfield built because Rick Ross understood something ruthless about branding. Buying a boxing champion mansion is not just real estate. It is inheritance by check. Rick Ross wanted the audience to feel Rick Ross had walked into shoes of a man who had punched the world into submission. The trophies, the legend, the square footage of a person who had earned history through fists. Rick Ross paid $5.8 million. And what Rick Ross actually purchased was a right to walk into a room and let the room do the bragging. And it worked. For a while, Rick Ross filmed music videos in the driveway. Rick Ross hosted the annual car show on the lawn until the car show became bigger than the album cycles. Rick Ross gave interviews from the library, the game room, the balconies, the pool deck, all stitched into a single message. Rick Ross had made it. Rick Ross had become the address, not just the artist. That is a masterclass in personal branding. Nobody can take that away from Rick Ross. But masterclass branding also has a side effect. When the paperwork attached to the branded property becomes public, the branding backfires at the same volume it worked. Every square inch of the promised land that Rick Ross made famous is now a square inch of the promised land that carries a tax execution. That is the invoice for turning a house into a hashtag. There is another piece of this that nobody in the current news cycle is stitching together. The Georgia Department of Revenue does not file tax executions on a whim. There is a process. There are notices. There are certified letters. There are phone calls. There are opportunities to negotiate. There are payment plans available to almost anyone who picks up a phone. For years is not a bureaucratic accident. For years is a decision. Somebody in Rick Ross' camp saw those notices come in and made a call about priorities. Somebody in Rick Ross' world decided the $29,000 could wait, and then decided again the next year, and again the year after that, and again until Georgia stopped asking and started publishing. That is not a story about taxes. That is a story about attention. Rick Ross' camp was paying attention to the car show, to the tour, to the crypto pitch, to the album rollout, to the Instagram feed, to the rivalry, to everything except the envelope with the state seal on it. And 50 Cent noticed exactly what Rick Ross' camp was not noticing. One more layer, because this is a part that turns a story from gossip into diagnosis. Every mogul persona in hip-hop is built on the same silent assumption. The assumption is that the money is real, the money is liquid, and the money is faster than the paperwork. Rick Ross was not the first rapper to build a lifestyle brand on that assumption, and Rick Ross will not be the last. But the assumption breaks the moment a state agency proves the paperwork can move faster than the money. Georgia just proved it. Georgia let the paperwork run a marathon while Rick Ross was busy running a sprint on Instagram, and Georgia won by a mile. That is the actual news buried under the $65,000 headline. Not that Rick Ross is broke or done. The actual news is that the mogul assumption failed. And once the assumption fails once, it can fail again, and every rival, every plaintiff with a phone number for a Georgia court clerk now knows exactly where the pressure point sits. That is the part 50 Cent has been waiting 15 years to see confirmed. Not the number, the pressure point. Because once you know where the pressure point sits, you never have to guess again. You just wait. And 50 Cent is a professional at waiting. So watch the promised land. Watch every gate, every fence, every filing that gets attached to that estate over the next 12 months. Because if 2021 to 2025 is any indication, the state of Georgia is not the last agency that has been quietly stacking penalties against Rick Ross, and 50 Cent is not the last enemy waiting for a document to make a caption easier to write. The promised land is a promise Rick Ross made to Rick Ross, and promises made by a man who forgot about a $29,000 bill for 4 years are the kind of promises that eventually get executed, literally, by the state, in a public filing. Posted to Instagram by 50 Cent before dinner. That is the story. That is the whole story. That is the story Rick Ross does not want you to see in one clean thread, because when you see the thread, you see the shape. And the shape is not a mogul. The shape is a performance. And the performance is expensive. And the bill, as Rick Ross just found out the loudest possible way, always comes due. Drop a comment below with what Rick Ross is going to post first. Denial, distraction, or diss. Because one of the three is loading right now, and 50 Cent already has a screenshot ready. The bill came due. Bye.